Special Reports is a daily show that will cover issues surrounding the economic collapse. All our reports and daily alert news are backed up by source links. We work very hard to bring you the facts and we research everything before presenting the report. Subscribe for latest on financial crisis, oil price, global economic collapse, dollar collapse, gold, silver, Bitcoin, global reset, new world order, economic collapse, economic news, political, geopolitical news. Today, we talk about Iran sanctions are damaging the dollar, de-dollarization and collusion against the U.S. Painful sanctions on Iran have demonstrated the long reach of the U.S. Treasury, forcing much of the globe to fall in line and cut oil imports from Iran, despite widespread disagreement over the policy. Yet, we are only in the first few chapters of what may ultimately be a long story that ends with the erosion of the power of the U.S. dollar. The role of the greenback in the international financial system is the reason why the U.S. can prevent much of the world from buying oil from Iran. Oil is traded in dollars, and so much of international commerce is based in dollars. In fact, as much as 88% of all foreign exchange trades involve the greenback. Moreover, multinational companies inevitably have some commercial ties to the U.S., so when faced with the choice of business with Iran or losing access to the U.S. financial system and the American market, the choice is an easy one. That means that even if European governments, for instance, support importing oil from Iran, the dominance of the U.S.-based financial system leaves them with very few tools to do so. European policymakers have scrambled to try to maintain a relationship with Iran, and have tried to convince Iran to stick with the terms of the 2015 nuclear deal, and Iran is still complying, but that doesn't mean that European refiners, who are private companies, will run the risk of getting hit by U.S. sanctions by continuing to import oil from Iran. In fact, they began drastically cutting oil purchases from Iran months ago. The dollar is supreme, it seems. But that isn't the end of the story. In several ways, the Trump administration is contributing to a growing threat to the dollar, even if that is hard to see right now. After all, the dollar has strengthened this year. U.S. GDP has grown faster than other industrialized economies, and the world has had to adhere to U.S. sanctions on a growing list of countries and entities, the most notable of which are Russia, Iran, and Venezuela. However, the America First foreign policy, the trade wars, and seemingly arbitrary nature of tariffs, transatlantic tension, and other geopolitical rivalries are all factors that could push the dollar off of its perch. But it is the extensive use of sanctions that stands out as arguably the most important factor that may ultimately undermine the dominance of the U.S. dollar, some experts say. That is especially true in the case of Iran. In the Iran case, the United States is damaging sanctions as a tool of statecraft. Kelsey Davenport, an Arms Control Association analyst, told The Washington Post in August, "The United States has put a lot of states between a rock and a hard place." The president of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, said a few days ago in a speech that the euro should be elevated as a reserve currency in order to break European dependence on the U.S. dollar. Juncker noted that the EU paid for 80% of its energy imports in dollars, even though only 2% of imports come from the U.S. There is no logic at all in paying energy imports in dollar, not euro, an EU diplomat told Politico. For instance, most dollar-denominated imports actually come from Russia and the Middle East. It speaks to the U.S.-oriented nature of the international financial system that a European refiner who wants oil from Iran or Iraq or Russia has to buy that oil in U.S. dollars and is subject to demands from Washington, even though no American entity has any role in that transaction. Obviously, so long as European and American interests were aligned, that arrangement worked just fine. But their interests have diverged on a range of issues, including NATO, the Paris Climate Agreement, and most significantly on the Iran nuclear deal. The demands by the Trump administration that Europe cut imports from Iran to zero seems to have been the final straw. Some in Brussels are now calling for a departure from the transatlantic relationship. The inability of Europe to blunt the impact of U.S. sanctions on Iran has demonstrated the dominance of the greenback and has pushed European officials to look for solutions. Some have proposed a rival international payments system. Others have suggested buying Iranian oil in euros. In August, the EU announced an €18 million aid package for Iran. Most recently, The EU, led by France, Germany, and the UK, are working on setting up a special-purpose financial company to help Iran skirt US sanctions and continue selling its oil. The company would exist to process payments for transactions with Iran, bypassing the typical financing channels, as reported by Spiegel. The US has a great deal of influence over and access to existing money transfer systems. There are plenty of reasons why this initiative may not get off the ground, or have only a limited impact. Private companies, for instance, would need to agree to play along, and there is little evidence so far to suggest that European refiners are willing to take that risk. And the attempt to elevate the euro to the same status of the dollar will be extremely difficult and would be a long-term project. But a growing effort at elevating the euro, or conducting euro-denominated oil sales, combined with a smattering of other initiatives intended to weaken the influence of Washington's financial dominance, could chip away at the dollar over time. Meanwhile, earlier this year, for its own reasons, China launched a yuan-denominated oil contract based in Shanghai. The move was intended to bolster China's currency, reduce foreign exchange risk, and in a broader sense, gain geopolitical and economic leverage at the expense of the dollar. The dollar remains all-powerful, but the Trump administration's aggressive use of sanctions, crystallized by its zero-tolerance sanctions campaign against Iran, could undermine the greenback over the long term if more countries begin to look for workarounds. A defining moment for the U.S. sanctions regime. Each year, the USA finds a new country or group of countries to target with sanctions. Each year the USA adds about 1,000 individuals to its ever-longer sanctions list. Now, U.S. sanctions are coming to a turning point. Up till now, the EU representing around the same percentage of the world economy as the USA was sitting put as the USA grew its sanctions regime to ever more bizarre proportions. Together, the USA and the EU constituted nearly half of the world's economy, and US sanctions previously only used to target the other half of the world's economies. Hitherto, the EU had no compelling reasons to strain its relations with the USA, because US sanctions do not affect them. But now, secondary sanctions regarding Iran also hit hard at strategic EU companies and financial institutions, and negatively affect EU global strategic interests in energy from the Persian Gulf. U.S. sanctions in effect attack the liberty, security, and sovereignty of its biggest group of friends, the EU. Thus, we have now come to a defining moment for the global sanctions regime run by the USA. The U.S. economy is already less than a quarter of the world's GDP in USD dollars, and in 2023 it will fall to only just about 1/5 of the world, source, IMF. The non-US part, the 4/5 of the world economy, now including the EU and China, constitute an increasingly advanced group, and they are about to collude against the U.S. sanctions regime. Collusion is the result of parallel interests, and the EU may not actually, or at least publicly, coordinate all its counter-sanctions with other major power centers. We talk about the world's most powerful and complex political economic structures starting to fundamental change here. So we need to analyze the bigger picture, how complete systems of counter-strategies against present and possible future U.S. sanctions are being planned and implemented by strong powers around the world, all directed, but maybe only sometimes coordinated, against the USA. These systems of counter-strategies will include, but not be limited to, the following: finance. Payment transfer streams will develop to avoid U.S. banks hurting the global position of the USA's major growth industry. It will be a chance, as well as a good excuse, for the EU, China, Japan, India, and everybody else to nationalistically promote their banks in the international system at the expense of U.S. banks. Looking at the long-term trend, the U.S. financial industry has become really the only big growth industry which drives upwards the USA economy. No other sector in the U.S. economy has the combination of size and growth that finance has. Weapons are a bit the same, but finance is unique in size, so this will be very hard for the USA. U.S. banks hitherto have a central role in facilitating all global money transfers, and a lot of international money transfers between third countries somehow technically go via the USA. This system architecture will now be stopped not just by China, but also by the EU, and probably by India. Everybody outside the USA will be reluctant to let their money be touched by U.S. financial institutions, or let their money touch U.S. shares even for a millisecond. And of course, the EU and China know how to engineer legal and technical solutions for this. The growth of U.S. credit card systems will be impeded. Instead, cards from China and EU, and India, will take bigger shares of this profitable and fast-growing world market. Russia was the first country on this trend, kicking out all U.S. credit card companies and inviting in the Chinese credit card system. The EU may well strengthen the role of EU credit cards and create actions which incidentally, will hurt U.S. credit cards in EU markets. The finance centre of London, UK will, after Brexit, be caught in this crossfire between the EU and the USA. If the UK sides with the USA against EU counter-sanction initiatives, the EU may develop strong tools to draw UK credit card business into EU jurisdiction. New global money transfer system regimes, which counteract U.S. influence on SWIFT, will erode U.S. political influence. The SWIFT system is based in Brussels, but under heavy U.S. political influence. Russia has already built itself an alternative to that. The EU can no longer accept that the US might be able to hurt EU companies on their SWIFT transfers. The EU will therefore have to take actions, either to liberate SWIFT from US control, or to create a parallel EU system. Avoid Wall Street. Why should countries take up loans in the US if they can have the same loans without risk of future sanctions from China, or even the EU? The IPO of the Saudi Aramco oil company has been stalled. Unconfirmed information states that fear of U.S. courts reaching out against Saudi assets after the 11th of September is part of the reason. Already, the trend is that the biggest IPOs in the world move to Asia. De-Dollarization. The EU now will shift trade of energy from dollars to euro. This trend will diminish dollars in other international trade. Trillions of international dollars from trade may come back to the USA, risking inflation and economic crisis. Gold is, according to unconfirmed reports, being speedily bought up by governments, not only by Russia and China, but even Turkey, recently also hit by U.S. sanctions. Strategic supply. Airbus cannot deliver airplanes to Iran because, among other things, vital parts are sourced in the USA. This will change. Strategic supply chains will morph to avoid U.S. sub-suppliers, carriers, ships, airplanes, technology, service partners, etc., fundamentally hurting the U.S. global position. We are not speaking used cars here, we speak strategic business sectors. The EU and China may not state this anti-U.S. sourcing publicly as an official policy. They will just pull the strings to do it very effectively in strategic sectors. Also, U.S. deliveries in other strategic sectors, like food, grain, and soy from U.S. farmers, and U.S. energy will be affected by counter-sanctions. China sheds U.S. soybeans and pushes their price down. The EU, less dependent hereof, may then use picking up cheap surplus soybeans from the USA as a bargaining card. The idea of larger U.S. delivery of LNG to the EU probably will be mostly words, but the amounts of LNG from the USA to the EU may possibly only increase marginally. The EU may even come to a cold calculation that the EU, in the gas sector, might have a more maneuverable partner with Russia than with the USA. The EU has in several aspects a substantially advantageous size relation towards Russia, and not towards the USA, and while Russia enjoys a good relationship with China, Russia will like to balance its relations too. Tourism and education. Tourism is one of the fastest growing industries in the world, and the USA sells its cultural influence to all tourists coming. University education is not only a strategic business. To finance national research, universities are also a cornerstone for the USA to influence future management generations around the world. Why not send tourists and students to other places and the USA? Chinese tourists and students are of significant importance to the USA, and China has plenty of other destinations to send tourists and students other than to the USA. Using the state to shield business. As a counter-sanction, the EU now moves central banks and state-owned companies into the fray as financing, business partners, and intermediate partners when dealing with Iran. U.S. sanctions on EU state-owned entities can then amount to a U.S. declaration of economic war, not only against EU private entities, but directly against EU states, buying other than U.S. weapons. The EU recently is implementing a grand and ambitious strategy to increase its own weapons industry independent of the USA. To increase the strength of EU weapons makers, the EU will need to minimize imports of U.S. weapons. The EU will have to make their own, only importing as few items as possible from the USA. Saudi Arabia is by far one of the world's biggest arms purchasers, and nearly all is bought from the USA. However, should the bromance between the leaderships of Saudi Arabia and the USA cool down, Saudi Arabia would be well advised to diversify their weapons sources too. And Saudi Arabia even already has Eurofighters from the EU, and embryonic arms relations with Russia, and to build on the collusion against the USA. US trade war unites the EU, China, India, the rest of the world, even the UK, against US interests. With aggressive, unilateral trade war started by the US, all the rest of the world will now have even more motives to coordinate their counter-strategies to the US sanctions regime. The EU may seem slow to react, and this may lure US politicians in their hubris to believe that the EU cannot or will not. But believe me, the EU will, because this has become a strategic must. The EU has seen the handwriting of US sanctions on their wall. They will think this through, plan, and make deep preparations to create EU sovereignty from US control. Just read between the lines of the US Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker's recent State of the Union speech. When the EU rolls out their US counter-sanction measures, it will be big, comprehensive, and very effective. Negative changes for the USA will last. Once alternative systems to US banks, finance, the US dollars etc. have developed and matured, they will not go away. The USA is in its hubris about to destroy its global claim for economic hegemony, and that is a good thing. Hegemony will no longer pay off for the US. The administration of U.S. President Donald Trump will reportedly announce new tariffs on about $200 billion on Chinese imports. Meanwhile, Washington has invited Chinese officials to restart trade talks later this month. While Washington extends a carrot to Beijing, it is also swinging a stick. It is nothing new for the U.S. to try to escalate tensions, so as to exploit more gains at the negotiating table. The unilateral and hegemonic moves by the U.S. will meet firm countermeasures from China. Against the backdrop of successive U.S. offensives in the trade war, China will not just play defense. Nowadays, economic and trade relations between China and the U.S. are so closely connected that they will not be easily broken by unilateral hegemony. China will choose the most feasible means as countermeasures. The trade war occurs at the 40th anniversary of China's reform and opening up. It is not only a challenge to the most important bilateral relationship in international politics of the past 40 years, but also a test for China to shape this relationship. China has never taken this trade war as an interim one, but a protracted one. The trade war launched by Washington, which targets made-in-China products and the Chinese market, has had a big impact on the global production and supply chain. Global economic prospects dim under unilateral U.S. actions. China, as a main driving force of the global economy, is able to correct and push the global economy onto the right path. Domestically, China is undergoing steady and solid economic structural adjustments. On the foreign front, it is accelerating its cooperation network by promoting the Belt and Road Initiative. This will not only consolidate China's ability to withstand the trade war, but also provide more choices for the future global economy. After several rounds of trade war, China has realized that the U.S. government intends to decrease trade and economic integration of the U.S. and China. The U.S. wants to reduce the challenges from potential rivals with its Make America Great Again ambition. Meanwhile, it can adjust its China policy to gain an upper hand in areas such as politics and security. The U.S. still wants to shape Sino-U.S. relations with its strength and consolidate its hegemony. However, today's world will not be easily manipulated by hegemony. China will not passively be subject to the U.S. maneuverings, nor will it allow any superpower to achieve its end by peremptory means. It is no longer the time when a country can achieve hegemonic dividends through coercion. The trade war is in essence a conflict and rivalry between unilateralism and multilateralism. Internal contradictions in international relations have become sharper. The war will not only affect the trajectory of China-U.S. trade relations, but also the existing global trading system rules and reforms. China will strengthen coordination and cooperation with all countries. China will explore ways to safeguard fairness and justice in the global economy, and will support free trade and the multilateral trading system. Thanks for watching. Tell us what you think in the comments section below.